Hello and welcome. I'm Suresh, Vasudevan, CEO of Sysdig. Let me just start first by thanking you all for joining us on what should be a fun panel. Time is a precious resource. I really appreciate you taking some of that to be with us and to network with your colleagues and peers in the industry. Before I begin, I also want to say it's a privilege to have such a great panel, esteemed folks with very strong background in cybersecurity, in governance. So let me just quickly introduce the panel. The first person on my right, Sherrese, is a global managing director now of Paul Hastings. You've been vice chair of the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Committee, or the practice within the firm, and also serve a large number of clients in media and technology on issues to do with cybersecurity, privacy, et cetera, and cyber incident disclosures. Yes. So welcome.
Thank you.
I have Kevin Mandia, who doesn't need introduction in the world of cybersecurity. I think from what I know, Kevin, you started as an officer in the Air Force, fighting cybercrime there, and then went on to start Mandiant, which again is at the forefront of incident response in terms of cyber readiness, and now you're part of Google. Stories later, but enjoying your stint as CEO of Mandiant at Google. Enrique, another person that's extremely well known, Enrique Salem, very well known in the cybersecurity space, having been CEO of Symantec for a long time and shepherding Symantec to sort of great heights. And then since then, partner at Bain Capital, leading infrastructure software investing with a focus on cybersecurity. Welcome. And lastly, Scott, who's a partner at Morgan Franklin, who has helped numerous public and private clients on something that we're all eager to understand, which is how do you implement compliance, how do you have internal controls, internal audit controls in place as you interpret the new governance regulations in cybersecurity and beyond. So let me start by just saying thank you all for taking the time. Most of what we're going to do is have the panel talk. I'm just going to try and keep the conversation flowing along the way. We'll also love the audience to ask questions. This is being recorded and will be a podcast at some point as well. To set the context, we all know that we're seeing breaches mount in frequency, breaches mount in terms of their impact, and with the advent of things like AI, it's also becoming clear that adversaries are getting stronger than defendants, I would argue, especially with nation-state adversaries at being able to do damage to companies. And maybe it's no accident then that the government has started to regulate the industry a whole lot more. And today, one of the topics we're going to touch on is really broad regulatory impact or driven by cybersecurity. But we're going to talk a little bit about the new disclosure regulations or the newly refined disclosure regulations by the SEC around cyber readiness disclosure, around cyber incident. But it's not just this regulation that's causing people to have to step back and think about their cybersecurity and regulation stance. It's things like DORA in the EU, which are having a massive impact in the EU around sort of what happens when you have cyber breaches and so on. So its regulations are everywhere, and the question is, how do companies prepare for that? With that as a backdrop, let me just start with a broad question on I'd love one of you to summarize the SEC's changed mandates and what are the sort of main points, if you will, of the regulation.
I'd be happy to give that background. So just for those that aren't aware, just to give a little bit of background of what is the rule and what it's trying to do. So the SEC, they've been dipping their toe into cybersecurity and how do they think about that as it relates to their registrants all the way back since 2011. So in 2011 and in 2018, they issued what they would call interpreted guidance for how companies should think about cybersecurity and as it relates to the materiality in their financial reporting and what they're putting out there into investors. Since 2018, since the last interpreted guidance that they've issued, they've continued to see some of the trends that you've talked about, the increasing prevalence of cybersecurity incidents out there, the cost to companies, the adverse impacts to companies, and just the more prevalence of companies using electronic systems and using more and more third-party providers. In addition, they've been seeing that how companies report cybersecurity incidents that they deem to be material have been inconsistent and not timely. And so based on that kind of background, they decided the timing was right to issue a cybersecurity rule, which is what we're all here to talk about today. So in March 2022, they issued a proposed rule that went through a very extensive comment process And in July of this year, they issued the final rule, which will now go into effect in December, in about a week. And that final rule, to kind of summarize it at a high level, then I'm sure we'll get into the details over the next hour, I would break it down into two primary chunks. The first part is, they are standardizing and codifying that when a company has a cyber incident that they deem to be material, they are now required to disclose that incident via a typical 8K, or if you're a foreign company, 6K process, which within 4 days of determining that incident to be material. From a timing perspective, from the date that the incident happens to when they make that determination, they say that timing has to be without unreasonable delay. So they don't give a specific timeline there, but they do, once you've made that determination, they start the clock at 4 days. They say the scope of that disclosure, what needs to go in that disclosure, is a company has to disclose the material aspects of the nature of the event, the scope, and the timing, and if there was any impact or reasonably likely impact on either the financial condition of the company or the operations of the company. And then finally, they enhance what is meant to be included as a cybersecurity incident, and they say that incidents from third parties now can be relevant to disclosing cybersecurity incidents, and then a series of unrelated cybersecurity or related cybersecurity instances also might be under this disclosure. And then the second piece of the new rule is making changes to what is required to be disclosed within your annual 10K or 20F if you're a foreign issuer. And that is, companies are required to disclose how they assess, identify, and manage their cybersecurity risk, how those cybersecurity risk processes are integrated into their overall risk management framework. Do they use third-party providers in the management of their cybersecurity risk? And provide a description of what is their cybersecurity processes for evaluating material incidents. And then finally, as a part of that annual disclosure requirement, companies are required to disclose what is their board oversight, and then how does management and the key participants in management, how do they report up to the board?
Thank you. That was very comprehensive.
Can I,
Please. It didn't take long, Enrique.
Sorry, I just want to ask, what did the SEC see that wasn't happening previously? I'd just love to hear, because I'm not as close to what they may have seen, so I'd love to hear.
Well, I'll take that. I mean, I think it's funny because that's part of the challenge, is that what did they see that wasn't already required? Because the key here is the materiality standard, which has always been there. I think the problem has been the inconsistency with how people were reporting it and whether shareholders were getting enough information to basically make informed decisions around the impact to the company. So let's be honest, a lot of this is codifying kind of what they were seeing, what they were hearing, and forcing companies to basically document that and to basically be much more transparent around that. But I don't think that the materiality standard has necessarily changed. These obligations were already there. Also, if you think about, we talked about unreasonable delay in the 4 days. Anyone who's an international company who's been dealing with GDPR and some of the European requirements also had those obligations as well. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that a number of companies who have been trying to do the right thing, trying to invest, trying to make sure that they are all over the issues, are saying, we're doing it. We've been required to do this already. What's different? But I think that's a very valid question. It's really around transparency, consistency, and codifying kind of what has started basically being the requirements over the last couple of years.
And now we're on the, and now we're on the 4-day shot clock, right? So because I think, sorry, I just cause trouble at these events. That's why I usually don't get invited back. But isn't that one of the biggest changes? Because like you said, materiality is not a new concept, but now we are on a clock that probably didn't exist before.
Well, the 4 days didn't exist before, but then also, some of this is there are qualitative kind of components and quantitative components. I think everyone understood the quantitative components. Everyone knew if it moves you over 5%, that's probably an issue. Everyone knows what the share price looks like. Everyone knows the impact of revenues. I think the trickier part is the qualitative, the impact on reputation, the brand, whether it's going to impact how customers and, perceive kind of what your services are. Are your services now being impacted from a service level requirement, right? Particularly now that we're out in California and SLAs matter, that's a big thing. So that's the piece I think that has probably troubled people more so than the quantitative piece, which has been there. It's the qualitative, what does that mean for your industry, for your company, and how it gets implemented in each individual company.
I guess one of the questions in that context is so now that the materiality standard maybe has been emphasized, not new, but emphasized, there's a clock ticking. I'm curious from the lens of an operational CISO, from someone who's in the SecOps team. Imagine that we're MGM, we found out we've been locked out of our Okta servers, and suddenly there's a breach underway. How does this impact how a SecOps team reacts when an incident occurs? Does the notion of having to determine materiality start to change the behavior of a CISO, of a security team, of a SecOps team? I'm curious, Kevin, you've been in many incident response immediately after the event.
Well, so I applied this standard written in 2022, right, the first drafts, to my own breach and our own response that we had to do at FireEye with the SolarWinds backdoor, let's call it, in our software that we found in 2020. And the new rules don't change how we would have responded. It didn't change anything. So going back to, what changed? To me, it was giving clarity to the timeliness and to standardize what we do report. And materiality to me, we outsourced it when we went through our own breach. I remember having John Carlin, our attorney, did we hit the bar of materiality yet? And it was, as a public CEO, I remember thinking, if we have anything material, could be earthquake, could be bizarre wicker chair accident at the factory, whatever it is, you file an 8K to communicate risk to your investors. So to me, I think we were approaching all along, but I outsourced the decision of materiality because it's just safer to do it. And I don't think that's in the hands of a CISO to determine. I think the CISO, what they should know is rapidly just get your arms around the totality of the circumstances. Systems impacted, data impacted, customers impacted, applications impacted, and push that to the center table for those that can assess the business impact. I think you're asking a CISO a heck of a lot outside of their skill set.
So I love that you said call the attorneys. We rarely hear that, but call the attorneys is great. But I was talking to my partner, David Ambler, who's out here in California, who has to basically handle these issues, right? Because a lot of times the materiality may differ depending on the industry, on the company, on who the customers are. And so a lot of times, the attorneys are able to say, in the media field, here's what materiality would mean for you as compared to your counterparts. That's very different from what's happening in energy. That's very different. So that analysis matters. And you're right, it's not fair to have a CISO be the person deciding those issues. That's what the outside counsels.
Well, you don't want, in my opinion, you don't want anyone with a vested interest. You do need someone who's not emotionally connected to help you think through the issues. And I thought, and that's what we've seen most companies do. I mean, my company helps folks respond to breaches and figure out what happened and what to do about it. And I think the advice I'd give any victim CEO and management team is outsource the materiality determination. Just answer the questions that the lawyers ask you, quite frankly. And they'll let you know when you've crossed the threshold where the right thing to do is start that 4-day ticker.
Can I just ask, just because all very logical. Now the question is, a lot of times on an incident, what happens is you start having an understanding of what's happened, but you don't know the extent of it. And so then the real thing I also think about is what should the right process be? So do we make the first disclosure once we've determined we have something that is fairly material, but then aren't we potentially making multiple subsequent disclosures? How should we handle that?
It's multiple disclosures.
Yeah. It's not a one-time disclosure.
Yeah, and I would say, and this is a lot of the challenges my clients are having right now, Fortune 100 companies, Fortune 500 companies, they probably have elements or most of this process in place, right? And it's just a matter of how do they tell the story the right way. A lot of mid-cap size companies, smaller companies, newer public companies, the problem I'm seeing them struggle with is just, do they have a process in place, right? Have they defined the process, right? Do they understand what we were just talking about a second ago? Do they understand all the parties that are going to be involved in this? The general counsel, the CISO, the CFO, accounting and finance, the board, maybe internal audit or some compliance function, right? So have they defined that process? And have they determined, okay, what are the various aspects of what do we care about from a qualitative, quantitative perspective of materiality? Have we defined that? What's important to our industry? And then, as a part of that, once they've defined the process, the policies and procedures, do they have the right data mechanisms and systems in place to go get the data they need to make those, those decisions that they need to make collectively? And then further, once they have that data and they've collected it, how are they escalating that to the right people and places, and how are they documenting that, right? Because all of this is going to come under scrutiny now, potentially, once this rule goes active. And what's that documentation process? Either determining something's immaterial, and then all the way, once it's material, into disclosure.
But even the documentation, I mean, you have to be careful with that. I mean, I always say, clients, and most people want to do the right thing. And so the gut reaction is, we want to tell the world, we want to be transparent. And I'm like, whoa, it's not about not being transparent. As you said, it's really determining whether you have hit that threshold. Also, what are you documenting? Because a lot of times, we want to know the information, but in hindsight, you've written it down, and then you found facts that later on have changed, and then you have this document that sounds worse than it is later on. So you really have to also be thoughtful about that. But kind of going back to the what do you disclose in the first instance, I'm always like, I'd rather be a little bit vague than to be to be detailed and wrong. There is nothing worse than trying to explain to the regulators that you said something that was not right. I'd rather be like, we were still investigating, we're still looking at it. And they understand that. Like, there's a sophistication now around that where they understand that you're trying to do it, it's going to be ongoing, you're learning what you can, but saying something and being wrong is just a death knell.
Yeah, because it'll be used against you.
Absolutely.
In some ways, that's why you call an attorney, just to be appropriately vague, but not. One thing I want to dig into is the notion that these standards have existed and companies have been following it. I think we were discussing this earlier. I saw a statistic on, I think the Verizon breach investigation report suggests that there are hundreds of data breaches when they do a survey across companies. And yet, I believe in the last 6 months, we've seen no more than 40-something 8Ks, of which it was, if you eliminate double counting, it was probably less than 24 8Ks. Now, it's possible that all of the balance were not deemed to be not material. Part of me wonders, do they have even a process to assess really if I should think about materiality? Because I go back to smaller public companies.
Well, real quickly, when you're breached and you know it, you're not thinking, wow, let's get the AK ready. I think you must, were you a lawyer? Because I would go right to my lawyer for this.
I am a lawyer.
Every lawyer that shows up to assist you on this is going to slap down the 4-dimensional spreadsheet on all the reporting requirements you have. Did you lose customer data? Yes or no? What are your contractual agreements? Let's go through every single one of them. What do you have to tell the DOD? What do you have to tell foreign governments? You go down, and what do you have to tell 48 or 49 different states for PII loss? At the end of the day, you got so many reporting requirements that the 8K could just come out of that funnel, because you're going to say, if we lost customer data and we have a reportable offense because of that, it's going to be material because we got to go public anyway, and then you start, working with your attorneys and folks to write the 8K. But I don't think we started during my breach, and nobody starts with how do we think about the 8K. So it's not a right metric to figure out breaches. You've got CISA trying to count ransomware, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. You've got the DOJ trying to run criminal cases on these folks and catch them, so they don't want your reporting stuff sometimes to jeopardize the investigation. All I can tell you is the fact that many 8Ks have been filed is probably fair, because the vast majority of breaches that we respond to well over 1,400 a year now, and these are the breaches that are at a scale and scope where people need help. I'm not convinced there's material impact in most of them. If it's theft of IP and it's quiet and you're losing your IP, but the impact as to what that is, it could be 5 years out when someone starts manufacturing something in China or whatever nation did it. Long story made short, just wanted you thinking about, there are so many reporting requirements. The 8K is not the measurement as to how many breaches there are.
And also breach, I think people use that term, but security incident is different from a breach.
Indeed.
A breach is different from a material breach, and the material breach is the one that's reportable. So that's kind of how you look at it. Every access, every unauthorized access doesn't necessarily mean that's something that's going to cause you problems. And if you're a big enough company, the reality is, and I'm sure Kevin could attest to this, you're going to have people trying to come in all the time, right? Most of the times your system's going to detect something, and if the system is actually doing what it's supposed to do, it will block it.
Right.
So but that's different than a breach. So.
But can we just go? I guess one of the things is having dealt both being on Kevin's board during FireEye and running a public company, when our company had lost source code 3 or 4 years earlier, and that had never, we actually didn't really know that we'd lost it until somebody contacted us and said, we have your source code and we're going to go public. Right? And we didn't know. And so at that point, we were trying to figure out, wait, one, what do they have? How much? Because we had no idea. First, we went back to 06. This is now 09, and we're trying to figure out what happened. We didn't really have any data. So at that point, I guess, what should we have been saying in 09, knowing we had some source code that had been lost? Should we at that point said, we've been told that somebody's holding us hostage? It was ransomware, but not because they encrypted our data, it's because they had our data. So what should we have said at that point?
Not material.
Is that right? Is that right? It's because
Well,
we did because
that's
we
how I'm
didn't.
going to answer all these.
Kevin, you just get into the lawyer world.
No, but Sherrese, I'd be curious. Is Kevin right here? Because we actually didn't know how much they'd taken at that point. We knew that they had source code to an important product, a product called PC Anywhere. So at that point, we should have said nothing. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the investigation is what was the impact of it? Was it taken from because of something you did? Was it taken from somewhere else? I mean, that's the problem. It's like a lot of these investigations, all you know is there's 3 years that have passed where nothing has happened. And doesn't appear that there's impact on the systems, on the revenue, on the anything.
But let me maybe say more, because it's an interesting situation. So PC Anywhere was used by...
And I'm also going to say, is this with Symantec?
Yes.
I'm now on the Norton board, so it was not material.
Well, the good news, Sherrese, is that the good news, Sherrese, is that you sold that business to Broadcom. But it's important because why it mattered was these folks were threatening to release the source code. This code was used by hundreds of financial service companies. I remember being on the call with the FSISAC, where they were just interrogating us on how do we know that they're not going to find a vulnerability in that source code that they release, right? And so I guess the customer impact was pretty serious, but it's an example of our customers were at risk. That's really what triggered us to go public, quite frankly.
Well, I was going to say, and that's, it's so funny because that's a lot of times why companies go public. A lot of times the obligation will be in your contract. If you have, if something happens, you got to notify us. If you're notifying people because you have a contractual obligation or you might as well say something at that point because it's going to also get out. So sometimes it's not even the materiality question, it's the fact that it's going to be public no matter what, and so you might as well get ahead of it, as opposed to having the regulators come ask you once they see it along with half the world.
I got to say, there's something that's not sort of slightly at odds. We talked to a bunch of customers who are in the CISO seat at this point, and there seems to be higher anxiety than sort of we are projecting here, which is not much has changed. And explicitly, last week I was talking to the fairly senior security leader in a large global bank, and the entire conversation, I sent a note to my team saying it was compliance cost, driven by DORA, and what it meant for them, and it took many shapes and forms. It was, what information do I not have that DORA requires me to collect in the event something goes wrong, etc. And so that's one lens into it. We'll come to SolarWinds in a moment, because I would also say from a CISO's perspective, it feels like whether it's this specific regulation or a collection of regulatory pressure, they don't feel equipped with the investments they need to know the answer to the question of what actually happened to determine materiality. Yes, a lawyer is going to determine the answer to that question perhaps, and that's the right answer, or an attorney is what you want doing that. But what investments do you need to make to be able to say, given this incident, I mean, you can always call Mandiant and sort of have them do forensic investigations, but presumably leading even up to that, you need to make investments that protect your ability to respond to an incident, know what's at risk, etc. I'm curious, so what are you all seeing from the point of view of the investments that security teams have to make?
Okay, well, I'll start, at least from, you don't want the first time that you know kind of what your systems are collecting and doing be at the time of the incident, right? So the basics of understanding, doing the data mapping, doing the exercise to really kind of dig into, at least for the valuable stuff, depending on the company size, you may not be able to do everything, but you better know what their finance systems are, hold, what the systems hold for IP, for those kind of things, and understand how to shut it off, how to, what to do from there. I think from a CISO's perspective, though, you also have to go to management, and sometimes management has to go to the board, say, these are our crown jewels. These are the things that if we either release them, they get, taken, or there's an impact on customer, will kill our business. That's when people are like, how much? Of course we're going to be supportive, but it really is going to be assessing the business, assessing where the risks are, and saying, priority 1, priority 2, priority 3. Priority 1, we got to get covered. Priority 2, really good to have, and maybe some of the other things are nice, but I think you have to really make that assessment based on the business. But I will tell you right now, for most companies, when the CISO says, I need this, the answer is usually yes at this point.
Right. I think that's right. I would say, you started at the right point there, Suresh. We have to go kind of the base level. So if we're going to try and do some kind of investigation, you got to start with knowing what you have and what you care about, right? I mean, and a lot of companies have a high-level view of what they should care about, customer data, source code, but you got to get a bit more rigorous on that. And that's not a technology problem, quite frankly. That is more of a businesses caring enough that they do the work. That's one. I think 2, then you need to have the right technology in place that gives you some level of visibility and understanding that when experts come in to try and help, they have enough data to try and put the story together. And that's not hard. It just takes a well-structured program that says, I need to be able to understand what we have, where is it, and what am I going to do if there is some kind of incident. But we don't have to make this hard. I think it's easy when you talk about something as broad-based as security to say, it's so complicated, we're such a big multinational company. I think that's the wrong starting point. The right starting point is, what do I need to have visibility into so I can do the right analysis and make the right determination? I don't think it's harder than that.
No, I completely hear you. I think this conversation quickly moved on to what are my top risks, because I can't cover everything if I interpret DORA in a rigorous way. I need to have a very clear perspective on what are my top risk areas and how do I know what my exposure in those risk areas. The other part of this conversation was how do I make the case internally for investment at a time when investments may be most challenged. And sort of, as you said, there's more of an ear to listen to cybersecurity investment needs within a certain umbrella of overall investment constraints, if you will.
But I do agree with Sherrese 100%. I mean, I have not seen, being on a number of both private and public boards, especially in my public boards, I've never heard the CISO say, I'd like to make an investment in this area, and the board say no. I just haven't heard it. Now, they may say, give me an envelope of give me a range of what that need is, but I think given appropriate governance at most companies, I agree 100%.
No, that makes sense. Another dimension of regulatory pressure that's not explicit regulation, since we spent so much time talking about this in our chat earlier, we all, I think, know the lawsuit against SolarWinds and specifically against Tim, the CISO. And I'm curious, I'd love to get perspectives on, there's one documented view that says it was the SEC's approach to making sure there's attention to the issue, and you needed a scapegoat, and you picked one, and that because the standard they're holding the specific CISO to is a standard that would put a lot of people at risk, not just this particular instance. There's another standard that said, well, the disclosures were egregiously delayed in the case of the sort of actual breach that happened with Sunburst, and maybe there should have been earlier disclosure specifically because there were at least half a dozen known victims before it came out in the public light and so on. So, I mean, I'm actually not...
There's multiple parts to that question.
Exactly. I think going down the rabbit hole of who's right there might be challenging, but I am curious, what does that mean? Again, sort of wearing the CISO's hat, if I'm the CISO at a company, what does that mean for how do I protect myself to make sure that I'm not personally liable, as was the case here? And does it lead to bad behavior internally on, do I just document everything I find in the fear that if I don't, I might be held accountable later? On the other hand, if I document, is that what's going to be held against me? I mean, it's a very tricky situation, I think.
I want to, I don't know all the details of what the SEC knows or doesn't know or who knows what in that case. You probably have more context, but where I would start, Suresh, I think is really important, is does a company have the right process in place of what they escalate beyond the CISO or the security team? To me, that's the starting point for this discussion, right? Because, quite frankly, I think to the comment that was made earlier, a lot of people don't know when to start escalating. And so just a good rule of thumb is most people, you won't be alarmist if you're over communicating. You should really feel like it's better to get your friends involved as early as possible and not wait. And I think that my advice to any security professional would be, once you know something is happening, don't just keep it to you and your security team. It's better to say, let me at least start getting my general counsel involved, get my operations team involved, get more people involved, because I think that's where you get yourself in trouble, Suresh, is when you feel like, wait, I don't want anybody to know that something's gone wrong, even inside my own company. And I think defining those processes is very important. Now, specifically on the SolarWinds Sunburst case, Kevin, you may have some comments or thoughts there. I love that look.
I just, in one line, if you're a CISO, have top-level buy-in to the actions you take. That means if you're going to pay a ransom, CEO's on board, board's on board. If you're saying things in 10Ks annually, CFO, CEO, and board is on board. Don't act as a lone wolf. I think it's unfair to peg a CISO as responsible for all actions when they depend on the entire company to help secure the organization. I think, well, that's all I'll say.
I guess I'm going to go back to you because you've been on the internal audit teams. You've advised internal audit teams, Scott. What changes would you suggest need to happen? If I were a company now that basically is worried about whether it's the SolarWinds precedent or the disclosure laws or in general the just rising frequency, and I want to come back to the other topic, which is how can you have a panel without talking about AI a little bit, but sort of this could really accelerate. And so what would you advise internally? What big process changes should companies make, especially along the lines that Enrique mentioned of have a process, et cetera?
Yeah, so from an internal audit, kind of that compliance function within a company, right? I'm probably looking at this in a couple of different ways. The first of all, and I think it gets to the point that was made earlier, is to meet this rule, are we going to have the capabilities and the processes in place across the organization to meet this rule and to tell our story, in the 10K or the 20F when we file these disclosures, right? And that starts at the board level. Right? Is the board communicating with the right people in management, with the CISO? Are they getting the inputs they need?
So you would advocate the board having access to the CISO and having a regular
Absolutely. That's going to be fundamental. Is the company thinking about the changes to the policies, the process, the internal controls that are going to happen to this? That'll have an impact if you're a public company. Then it's one step down from a risk management process, right? Is the company doing the right things around risk management? Have they done a cybersecurity assessment? Have they implemented or changed their policies and procedures to meet, this new requirement? And then it's probably one step lower than that. And have they defined clearly what that incident reporting process is going to be? What are the handoffs going to be? Because that is now very material to the financial statements. And so does the company understand that? And then the other thing I'm looking at from a compliance perspective is, and I mentioned this a second ago, is how does this change our internal controls? Our internal controls over financial reporting, what's going to change as it relates to that? And it's going to probably take a little while to play out, but there's going to be probably some impactful changes. Your entity level controls are going to change, your policies and procedures, your training of employees, your board governance. Some of your business process controls are probably going to change. This incident reporting process that now is driving an 8K, that's probably, in-scope controls that are coming along with that. And then, historically, especially smaller companies, mid-cap companies, and lower, cybersecurity, the processes, the systems related to cybersecurity, those have been typically out of scope for things like your SOX auditors and your external auditors. I envision over time, this drives more of those systems to be in scope, right? So you're going to start getting scrutiny over some of that incident reporting process, over your cyber systems, where maybe that was relegated to like a SOC 1 or a SOC 2 in times, but now that's going to be more towards your external auditors as well. So is the company prepared for that? And are they ready to face those questions?
So the only other thing I would say about the policies and procedures is actually practice them. Because I got to tell you, sometimes we'll come in, and of course these are other law firms who do this, not us. But you'll see these books that are 17 pages of what to do, and in the crisis, no one knows what to do because they've never practiced it. So it's like you've got all this documentation that means absolutely nothing when people are freaked out. So one, you got to have them, but you got to keep them simple, and you got to go through the tabletop exercises. You got to go through it because inevitably that's how you find out that, oh, we should have done this, or this person should have been contacted, or we should have looked at these systems. But that constant and consistent practice is absolutely critical because the policies and procedures mean nothing if you don't know what to do with them at the right time.
Again, couldn't agree more, and I think the other thing is it's a ever-changing document. So when you do that exercise, I think it's important everybody learns, you probably update, but then when it actually happens, you better update it again. And because I think that's one of the challenges with a lot of the documentation we produce inside of organizations. They sit on shelves, and they're not practiced, they're not updated, and they're useless. I mean, it's really more than just, write something down. It's do all of the steps it takes to make sure you're ready.
Right. It always cracks me up too when you see documentation where they'll say, call Sherrese. I'm like, it shouldn't say Sherrese because when Sherrese leaves the company, it should say your outside counsel. Even those kind of basic things you'll see in a lot of documents where it's like, there should not be a person. There should be a job title where you know where to go. But again, you don't know those things until you've gone through and practiced it to figure it out. And those postmortems, spend the time to figure out once it's all over, what could we have done better? What went wrong? And it's the time to have people be honest, upright, forthright, so that you can make it better for the next thing. Because inevitably, there's always going to be a next thing.
So Kevin.
Yes, Enrique.
You've been very quiet.
Yes.
So based on this comment, though, which we all have seen, where an incident happens, I mean, your team has done a lot of work to help people improve those processes. What are some of the common changes you see post-incident? After you've responded, what are some of the things that you see being updated as a result of the incident?
The dry run matters more than anything you write, period. Your undocumented process is actually what you're going to follow. I've never, the day I've responded personally to hundreds of breaches. If I ever responded and saw someone pull something off the shelf, I'd be scared out of my mind. So nobody's pulling any documents off the shelf during a breach. The dry run's critical. Who do you have to call and when do you have to call? I would say this, every single incident response plan ought to have right up front the caveat of, assess the current incident and make sure you have the best plan for that incident so that somebody post the incident doesn't grab your plan and say, why the hell did you deviate from it? Because you have the license to deviate as you see fit. I think the dry runs, though, mean the biggest bang for the buck any company can do is simulate an incident that you really don't want to live through. Do the ransomware incident, it shut down the hospital, and just live it and see, can you practice the red lever events? Can we execute off the internet? Can we execute with pencil? I remember during one breach, a whole bunch of restaurants couldn't function appropriately due to a ransomware attack against Kaseya. And half the restaurants couldn't take orders because people didn't, like the iPad can't connect and I don't remember what's on the menu. Just have a couple practice sections to be able to run your business the way it used to run in the 70s and 80s probably, you know, and I think a lot of businesses can do that. But the change, I don't see a whole lot of people changing the plan.
But what would you recommend they change?
Oh, boy. Everybody, for the most part, everybody's got a security program that's in flux, going up and to the right at all times. I mean, everybody can Monday morning quarterback a breach and say, boy, I wish I implemented whatever, better identity security 2 days ago. The reality is I think just move on. I don't know. I think one thing I would tell you we do differently, though, is we at least test the network for like the same attack again to make sure it doesn't work. The red teaming becomes, the trust but verify becomes a reality, because companies that haven't had a breach in about 10 years, the CISO shows up in the boardroom with, boom, everything's in the green. Okay? Is it? You know, and by the way, if I'm a CISO, just keep everything amber and keep it ambiguous so everybody's frustrated with you. It's because boards don't know how to feel when you show them the amber. They're like, oh, am I mad? Am I happy? I don't know what to do, and they freeze. If you put it in red, you're in trouble, so you can't do that. Or just pick your own code, go light blue or something like that. But I do believe this, the red teaming, test and verify becomes critical. And then if they didn't do a dry run ahead of time, they're absolutely doing at least one a year. And the dry runs get more inclusive, I've noticed. Like operational management will do it with the board now. It used to just be operational management would do it. And we're not talking an all-day death march dry run. We're not talking even 4 hours. Heck, even 2 hours of simulation is tremendous bang for the buck. So long-winded way of saying, I've never seen anyone say, well, get the plan off the shelf, dust it off, we're going to rewrite it now. They have it. They may change the threshold at which they escalate alerts in the future.
But don't you think, Kevin, I guess what we're saying is we agree no one pulls the manual off the shelf.
Yeah.
But shouldn't you be saying, as I go do my next simulation, what am I doing? What are the things
you learn who's the real characters that influence your response. Wow, that person was exceptional. We're bringing them in. They weren't even on the list. We're going to escalate a little sooner. The board can handle it now. So we're bringing them in a little quicker. We don't have to fear that. Like, you just learn the bench. In my opinion, it's threshold, timeliness, content. That's your three variables for every stage of a breach. Who do you have to tell? How much you have to tell? What threshold before you tell them? All those things get tweaked a little bit each time you go through something.
That's interesting. I love that framework. Threshold, content, time.
Pain scale.
Yeah.
It's a 9 out of 10. Pucker factor 5. You escalate. But true story. You go to different companies. One of the first things I do during any dry run is you just ask, what events would you escalate? And there's some companies, the systems like, I wouldn't escalate that. I wouldn't escalate that. I wouldn't escalate that. And after a while, you're like, you might want to escalate a few just to test to see whether you should or not. Quite frankly, you know.
What, from a threat vector standpoint, given sort of what you've seen practically of incident response engagements that you've been on, some of the biggest changes that companies are experiencing are a greater move to the cloud. Now there's sort of more of an adoption of AI, and there's a concern that perhaps, and this is a practical challenge that I hear, which is so much of our security investments are caught up in maintenance or sustaining the investments that we've had to make in traditional. As we've moved more into newer areas, how much can we shift of our security budget, whether it's towards cloud security, whether it's to protecting AI investments or modern data? What vectors are you seeing that where you feel like it's sort of not adequate for the kind of incidents you're seeing? Yeah, I'm curious. Given the engagements you've seen, are there areas that are high risk?
To me, it's depends on what state you're in security, but real quickly, cutting through the chase. In the cloud, I think almost every breach you respond to, it's lost tokens or keys or credentials. The attackers are literally just mining GitHub and other repositories, trying to find hard-coded tokens and using them and accessing the control plane. Fine. On-prem, its vulnerabilities has become the number one way. It used to be spear phishing. And it was spear phishing from 2003 to 2019, and we started seeing vulnerabilities, kind of an exploitation of those vulnerabilities, kind of take the front seat. And in the U.S. today, this year to date, we've seen high 60s for 0 days. And the best security companies are recognizing, the best security programs are recognizing, just assume 0-day, assume credential loss, assume you're spear-phished, assume that you've been socially engineered by a threat group, and how great your identity security is becoming real important.
I think we're 5 minutes away. Let me pause for a second and just see if anybody here wants to ask any questions of the panel, any topic.
I'll say it again, it was awesome. Thank you very much, everyone. Very interesting. Can we flip this around and say that risk management should become, finally, after 30 years, we all know we need to take a risk management approach. Do we have to wait for the bang and kind of scramble on the investigation to determine materiality? Can we upfront some of that? Can this be a forcing point for organization to finally know what we need, what we know they need to do, which is a proper risk management? As the incident gets investigated, we know which one of these branches we are, or am I just dreaming in here?
Just one quick difference on risk, because I hear this so much. I'm surrounded by the best risk guys in the world. Risk doesn't have an adversary trying to beat you every day. This one does, and that's one of the biggest differences. And so I'll leave you with that, but that actually permeates to like 8 other points I'd make. The fastest answer I'd give you, you're in the ring with Mike Tyson some days, and that's a little bit different than risk of weather or risk of financial fraud. Someone with literally no risk of repercussions is trying to beat you up. That's a problem. So it's a different risk calculus than the math you do for, accounting and other risks.
Mike Tyson will knock you out, I think, is what he's saying.
Everybody has a plan until you get punched on the face. Well, that's what Mike said.
That doesn't mean we give up, though, right? That's the reality. But that's why it's so hard to quantify the risk in cyber, because today a new startup's making an app that in 6 months suddenly 17 million people are using it, and the 1A enterprises are the earliest adopters. And I can tell you this: last year Microsoft had 18 0-days used in the wild, and they're not trying to ship insecure code. I'm at Google, we had 10 0-days used in the wild last year. We're not trying to ship insecure code. And Apple had 9. Those are the 3 largest software companies almost on the planet with as much resources as you can to ship secure code. And that's how complex it is to get it right. Imagine this new app, 17 million people using it, and suddenly it's got software that relies on software, relies on software, and now we have a third-party insecure software. That risk is currently real hard for us to quantify because it emerges very quickly.
And it's also part of the business. I mean, that's the thing, too, that can't get lost with all of this stuff. And I say this being the lawyer. Businesses have to do their business. Innovation has to happen. So there's inevitably going to be some type of risk. So you're trying to move business forward, figure out what's happening with our industries, figuring out what we need, right? If you're talking about AI, none of us knows what that's really going to be today versus 5 years from now. So that risk management, if you're doing it the right, is constantly evolving. You're constantly having the conversation, and you can have the best laid plans of what's risk today that will change 30 days from now.
I'm going to take both your earlier comment as well and suggest that what I think we're saying is, on the one hand, you have to invest in securing your supply chain, in managing identities if you're operating in the cloud, in making sure that you're not misconfiguring in an egregious way, et cetera. So there is risk management and sort of investment against egregious entry paths into your estate. But at the same time, nothing you do can fully stop extremely well-armed adversaries with nothing to lose. And so you also have to worry about what do you do knowing that they're going to find a way in. So it's not enough to just sort of do the hardening, if you will, and manage the risk earlier on. Please.
Do you see, so MGM, those guys make the news with smaller companies. How often are they targets of attacks?
That one's for you, Kevin.
I just think when they're smaller, it just goes by quicker. It's that simple. Like the amount of times a hedge fund will call, hey, Mandiant, we need help. We've been ransomed, and the ransom's $50,000, and they're back up and running. They just get handled faster, and they're less complex. I hate to say it. I think there's more of them than I see, and I probably minimize the problem because I know the 1A enterprise problem far greater. and how much pain is caused there. And the ransomware numbers keep going up, and yet we're not seeing it at the 1A enterprise anymore, which means ransomware is actually hitting small to medium businesses, and we don't get those calls. But all I can tell you is when we do, they don't even have the visibility to make the investigation fruitful sometimes. So that's a long-winded answer, and that's why we won't get any more questions probably. But that's my way of saying, for us, when we respond to those things, it just seems like a less complex problem. They're not multinational, and we're done in like 3 days.
But I think if you think about it from how vulnerable are you to, I would say, at least in our customer base, when we look at our mid-sized companies, it often is things like minors, right? Where you've stolen some resource or you've hijacked some bandwidth, and that happens all the time. So even within our customer base, you hear about incidents that have been mitigated or experienced. I don't think it goes into a huge chain of reaction and how do we respond and what do we do later, but the incidence is very, unfortunately, quite frequent. It doesn't have all the ramifications, I think, is what I would...
I can tell you, too, just like the group that hacked MGM and Caesars has hacked over 150 companies in the last 2 years, so it's the brand matters as to how much. And then, you look back on some of the breaches we responded to, some of them they go public and nobody even notices because, Mandela died that day or something like that, and you get some news coverage. I've had a tough time figuring out which ones go huge and which ones don't. And I haven't been able to ever pick the public's response or the government's response to a breach with 100% accuracy. But the smalls are usually just unknown. Like if you went public, and most people just wouldn't recognize the brand to know much about it.
And I do think to that point, right, when you're thinking about this rule and what is material versus immaterial, right, I think that matters. Your industry, the size of your company, what matters to your investors versus maybe what matters to another company's investors, it can be very different, right? So a small industrial products company that gets hacked, that's very different than a front-facing, company with a lot of customer data, right? So that distinction and those kind of getting back to that qualitative point, right? It really can make the difference of how impactful it is and what do you have to disclose versus not.
As a question for Kevin. On the topic of ransomware, do you typically recommend that companies pay?
No recommendation there. That's way above my pay grade. To me, I can tell you this, we get the question a lot because people want to mandate from the government, make it unlawful to pay, or make the exception have to be approved. I've never met a CEO with default, hell yes, we're paying. I've just never seen it. They always start with, we're not paying these SOBs, and what do we have to do to not pay? The problem is that it's changed to extortion now. And so now as less and less people pay because we can recover quicker, people are doing backups, people are planning ahead with ransomware assessments, now we're losing data. And what I've seen as the number one factor, if I'm a fly on the wall, is how do we, if we pay the ransom, are we protecting the information of professional athletes, our customers, famous people? That's a tough one. I don't envy the decision that people have to make of pay or not pay, but it is harder than people realize. You could have the playbook, take it off the shelf, don't pay no matter what, and go, wait a minute, this app that crashed, we didn't realize that place was using it and lives are at stake or something. So it has been done and paid for safety reasons more than any other reason. No, I don't make no way. I don't even want to know if they pay or not because I don't want to be subpoenaed if this goes public. Don't subpoena me. I don't know who paid.
So they ask the lawyers a lot about, really, the law firms tend to be the ones where do you pay or not, because it's all of the, are we talking safety? Are we talking, something that's going to devastate people? Because data, if you're doing it right, going back to you should have backups. It may be painful, but you should have recovery mechanisms. So at the end of the day, while it might be not great, it may be a PR kind of nightmare, that's different from lives being at stake. And you pay one, you tend to pay. So I will tell you, I'm not a fan of paying unless there is something seriously at risk. The other thing that people forget with ransomware is that a lot of these companies may be on the US government sanctions list. And if you pay them, that is unlawful and illegal. So that is a problem. So a lot of times, the people who are asking are on that list.
Well, yeah, you don't know who you're paying, right? But it's the vast majority of ransomware cases, within the first minute, the CEO is telling me, if I'm on the conversation, we're not paying. I mean, it does change how you think about it. I don't really care one way or another, I hate to say it. I think maybe as a citizen, you don't want to see people pay because it supports the propagation of ransomware being effective. The challenge is, as we don't pay it, it is going to extortion now. And I hate to say it, that's more painful for the victims. It's the stealing of your CFO's email. How much do you want to pay to not see that on the internet? These are very hard things to witness.
It's interesting because Caesars decided to pay, MGM decided not to pay. I mean, you could sit back on an armchair and decide which one was more prudent, but at the moment, it's a dangerous decision either way.
Look, reasonable and smart people will disagree on what to do. I mean, this is. I think that's the first place you got to start, and having all of us are involved in businesses that you assess, as Kevin and Sherrese were saying, but business disruption. If you're a CEO and you have meaningful business disruption, at some point, you feel that pain. You're trying to figure out how to stop that pain. Now, I am with Sherrese and all of us. None of us want to pay. I mean, that is absolutely your instinct. But you also got to assess your business impact. I mean, it's about safety, it's security. It's also, am I going to be out of business if I don't get back up and running? Because, look, I'm on boards of multiple backup companies, data protection companies. Backups will get you so far, and you should have them. But they won't necessarily. Colonial had plenty of backups, but they also didn't understand the connectivity between production, ERP systems, and other important systems, and weren't able to get back up and running as quickly as they needed.
And you're also hoping the bad guys actually keep their word. And, right? Like, so you can pay and get nothing in return. And that has happened. So it's not easy. I mean, it's very complicated. So I think it goes back to the plan and prepare before there's an issue. Have the backups. Every company should understand what's the kill my business information that should be backed up consistently, and what's it's not great and it's inconvenient, but we can still survive. That's critical. You got to know that. It could kill my business should never be, oh my gosh, I mean, to the extent possible, but that should never be what are we going to do now, or we need to pay. That should always have multiple safety guards, in my opinion.
One last question, and then we'll probably, all yours, Karen.
Someone else has one? Okay. Yes, I'm just curious on what you all are seeing in terms of board composition and whether that's changing in light of these new rules. I think I read in the spring in the Wall Street Journal that boards were saying, just generally a polling, that maybe only 40% of boards felt really comfortable with their companies, the companies they served on the board with their cybersecurity program. So just curious, I know, Kevin, I heard what you said earlier about people have talked about CISOs or whatever, but just kind of curious. I think some folks have developed risk committees and things like that, but would be curious to see what you all are seeing.
So I was going to say I'm very popular right now. Boards love me. They want to get me on boards because boards want that expertise. So like that's ideal to have someone with that background being on boards. The other thing though is there's this tension between, well, is it a nom-gov issue? Is it a governance issue? Or is it really an audit risk issue? And again, that depends on the board, the company, where it may sit. One of my companies, actually, we have a cyber committee, subcommittee now that only focuses on that because what we do is privacy and security for consumers. But that decision has to be made. Every board should at least have the conversation of who are we? How does privacy and security impact us? Is it truly a risk audit? Is it more governance? But I think it is really going to depend. But people are looking for some type of expertise throughout the boards. I think the other thing you're seeing is constant reporting. So going back to the CISO coming, most boards at this point, before they'd be like, once a year you come in and there'd be a check mark and that's it. Every quarter now, there's part of those presentations, what's happening with privacy and cybersecurity. Is it amber? Is it red? Is it green? That's just part of the routine because, going back to, kind of SEC reporting, and like I said, David Ambler and I talk about this a lot, that's part of it. So you have a board and they haven't met in 2 years. Nobody's come by and talk to you about kind of these issues, but yet you're saying you have the right controls and you're doing what you need to do. Kind of problematic. You never want to be the board trying to explain why you never had a meeting or people weren't on top of it.
I'm going to stop at this point. I just want to say thank you again to everybody that joined us. Thanks for the time, attention. We went a bit longer. Also want to thank the panel very much. And lastly, I want to thank Karen, our CFO, who was the impetus behind organizing this. You had so many conversations on this topic. Karen decided she's going to organize a panel and brought a great set of panelists to bear. So thank you all very much.